Deadwood, in the fall of 1878, was a place of smoke and promises. The mines worked from before dawn. Carts came down, loaded with ore through the dirt streets, and the miners sang old songs to forget the cold. On the main street, the shopkeepers opened their canvas awnings. The smell of freshly baked bread mixed with tanned leather and chimney smoke. Children ran between the horses tied up in front of the blacksmith shop, dodging the puddles left by the September rains. It was a young town, made up of people who had come from everywhere, looking for a second chance. No one there was rich, but almost everyone had something. A job, a roof, a family. Among them lived Elijah Hale, a 34-year-old miner, along with his wife Sarah and their 3 children, Daniel, 12 years old, Mary, 9, and little Thomas, who had just turned 5. They lived in a single rented room behind the grain store. It wasn't much, but it was theirs as long as they could pay for it. It wasn't an easy life, but it was an honest one, and that, to them, was worth more than the gold others searched for in the mountain. Then, in November, the coughing began. At first, no one paid it much mind. An old miner started coughing blood at the tavern, and everyone thought it was mine dust. But then another coughed, and another. A whole family near the church woke up with fever. The town doctor, a young man named Whitcomb, newly arrived from St. Louis, gave the name everyone feared to hear. It's consumption, what some now call tuberculosis. The word ran through Deadwood faster than any horse. In just a few weeks, the town changed its face. Families began sealing doors and windows, convinced that the cold night air was what brought the sickness. They stuffed the cracks with damp rags. They kept fires burning day and night, even when the heat made the inside of the houses unbearable. No one knew it then, but that habit, born of fear, was exactly the opposite of what they should have done. They were trapping stale air alongside the sick, and that still, heavy air was what best carried the contagion from room to room, from bed to bed. The hotels filled with families fleeing their own homes, crowding themselves together even more between closed walls. The mine-cut shifts. The parson rang the bells more and more often, and fewer people dared ask who they tolled for. Elijah lost his job in December when the mining company shut down 2 of the 3 tunnels. Overnight, he had 3 children, a wife, and almost no money. That was when he heard, at the tavern, the conversation that would change everything. "Still up for sale, you know," the land agent was saying, chuckling under his breath. "The cabin on the wind, the one on the ridge, above the creek. The owner just wants to get rid of it, practically giving it away." The men around the table laughed too, but with an uneasy laugh, the laugh of someone remembering something they'd rather forget. Elijah had heard about that cabin his whole life in Deadwood. It stood a little over an hour's walk away, atop a ridge swept by wind nearly all year round. No one had lived there for almost 20 years. Rumor had it that 3 families had died, one after another, within those walls. The town children pointed at it from a distance and said the mountain chose who could live there. No one else dared buy it. That's why it cost what it cost, almost nothing. That night, Elijah walked back to his room with an idea fixed in his mind. He couldn't pay another month's rent. He couldn't stay in a town where coughing could be heard behind every door. And above all, he couldn't stop thinking about a man he had known as a boy. When Elijah was 10 years old, an old Scandinavian hunter named Lars Eriksson lived for a season in that very same cabin on the ridge. Elijah used to visit him after school to help him tan hides in exchange for stories of the north, of frozen fjords and ships that crossed seas he would never see. Lars had a strange habit. He never slept with the windows closed, no matter how hard it snowed. "Never sleep in a house where the air stands still, boy," he used to tell him. As a child, Elijah thought it was just an old man's superstition, like so many others the immigrants brought from their faraway lands. But the phrase had stayed etched in his mind. Now, with the town sick and the cold as an excuse to seal every house, Elijah couldn't stop thinking about Lars's words. He didn't understand the reason behind them. He knew nothing about microbes or contagion, but he trusted that man's experience the way he trusted the edge of a well-sharpened axe. He didn't need to understand the forging to know it cut. Sarah opposed it from the very first moment.
Are you out of your mind, Elijah? That house killed 3 families. Everyone knows it.
Or no one else knew how to see what it had, he answered, his voice low but firm. There's a reason it's so cheap, Sarah. But maybe it's not the reason everyone believes. They sold nearly everything they had. The few pieces of furniture, Sarah's grandmother's dishware, a pocket watch Elijah had kept since his wedding day. With that money, they bought the essentials: flour, salt, vegetable seeds, farming tools, a thin but healthy milk cow, and half a dozen hens. When the town found out that Elijah Hale had bought the cursed cabin and was taking his whole family to live there in the dead of winter, tongues did not stop wagging. He's taking those children to their deaths. That house already killed 3 families. It'll kill a 4th. That man lost his mind when he lost his job. No one saw them off with good wishes, only with pitying looks, the kind you give someone already considered lost. The cabin, when they finally arrived, had nothing welcoming about it. The roof leaked, the fence had collapsed in 3 stretches, the well was covered over with rotten leaves and branches. What had once been a garden was now a tangle of dry weeds, barely visible beneath the season's first snow. Sarah stood in the doorway, with Thomas asleep in her arms, looking at the place with eyes full of doubt.
Who builds a house like this in the middle of winter?
She asked, pointing at the windows. There were 2 on opposite walls, something uncommon for the time, and a small opening above the chimney that let in a draught of freezing air. Elijah looked at the structure for a long while before answering. Someone who wanted to keep breathing. That night, while the children slept huddled by the fire and Sarah mended an old blanket by candlelight, Daniel, the eldest, found something beneath a loose floorboard near the chimney. A small wooden chest, closed with a rusted clasp. Inside was old clothing, an empty glass jar, and a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and filled with the cramped handwriting of someone who wrote in a hurry. It was the journal of the first doctor who had ever tended that region, decades before. He knew nothing of the existence of microbes, but he had noted, with the patience of someone observing over years, patterns that surprised even himself. The sick worsen in closed rooms. Those who sleep with windows open recover faster, even though logic says otherwise. The morning sun seems to restore strength to those who receive it every day. Damp houses sicken whole families, while dry, well-ventilated houses are nearly always spared. Never wash the clothes of the sick in the same water used for drinking or cooking. I built this house with 2 opposite windows and an opening above the fire so the air would never stand still. I cannot explain why it works. I only know that it does. Elijah read those lines over and over that night by the fire. These weren't the words of a man of modern science. They were the humble notes of someone who had watched the world around him closely and who had trusted what he saw, even without being able to fully explain it. He understood then why the cabin had those strange windows, why the wind came and went all day, why Lars Eriksson never slept with the windows shut. He said nothing to Sarah that night. He only tucked the journal beside his pillow, like someone keeping a treasure he didn't yet know how to use. The first weeks were hard. The cold crept through every crack. Sarah cried more than one night, thinking she had made the worst mistake of her life. But little by little, very slowly, the cabin began to change its face. Elijah repaired the fence, log by log. Beneath the garden's overgrowth, he found 3 apple trees still alive, twisted but strong, just waiting for a bit of care to bear fruit again. He cleared the well and found clear, cold water flowing from a hidden spring higher up on the ridge. He built a small henhouse from the old shed wood. The hens, clumsy at first, soon settled into their new home and began laying eggs every morning. The cow, fed on hay Elijah cut in the afternoons, gave enough milk for the whole family and then some. Mary, the middle child, took it upon herself to tend a small corner by the door where she planted mint, sage, and chamomile seeds. Sarah had kept wrapped in a handkerchief ever since leaving Deadwood. She spent her afternoons talking to the plants as if they were people, and Daniel teased her for it, though in secret he talked to them too whenever he thought no one was watching. Little Thomas discovered that goats made better playmates than any city child, and spent his afternoons chasing them across the ridge, laughing until he was out of breath. Sarah learned to churn butter, to preserve eggs in lime, to cure the venison Elijah hunted in the nearby woods. She discovered, to her own surprise, that she had a knack for tasks she had never done back in town. In the evenings, while snow fell silently outside, the family gathered by the fire. Elijah carved small wooden toys for Thomas. Daniel learned to sharpen tools. Sarah sang, sometimes, songs her mother had once sung to her. The dog they had adopted from town slept curled up by the chimney, as if he too had finally found a home. There was something in that simple life none of them had ever known before. They weren't rich, they had nothing to spare, but they had time, they had health, and they had each other. Amid all the work, there were also moments of laughter no one expected to find in a place with such a cursed reputation. One morning, Daniel tried milking the cow for the first time and ended up with more milk on his shirt than in the pail, to the roaring laughter of his younger siblings. Thomas, not wanting to be left out, decided to try the same with one of the goats, which answered with a gentle headbutt that sent him tumbling into the snow. Even Sarah, who hadn't laughed for real in weeks, had to hold onto the fence from laughing so hard. "Seems like even the animals have opinions in this house," Elijah said, wiping tears of laughter as he helped his son up. Those small moments, insignificant to anyone watching from the outside, became the family's true anchor during the hardest months of winter. It wasn't just the work that kept them going. It was also the habit of finding every single day some small reason to smile. One afternoon, watching the sunset from the newly repaired porch, Sarah rested her head on Elijah's shoulder. "I think for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of tomorrow." Elijah didn't answer. He just held her a little tighter. While the ridge bloomed, Deadwood withered. Worse news arrived from town every week. Whole families bedridden, less and less smoke rising from the chimneys because there was no one left to cut wood. The church bells tolling almost daily. Dr. Whitcomb, exhausted, going from house to house with nothing left to offer but cold compresses and words of comfort. An old mining companion, Robert Cassidy, climbed up the ridge one afternoon to ask for work, anything, in exchange for food for his children. Elijah gave him half his apple harvest and all the corn he could carry, asking nothing in return. "You ought to be afraid we'll pass something on to you, living so close to the sickness," Cassidy told him, his voice cracking with the shame of having to ask. "Fear doesn't fill stomachs, Robert," Elijah answered. "Take what you need." That night, after Cassidy left, Sarah looked at her husband with an expression mixing pride and worry. "Aren't you afraid the sickness will make its way up here?" Elijah looked toward the window, toward the wind that never stopped blowing over the ridge. "I fear still air more than I fear the wind, Sarah. I always have." By late winter, when the epidemic was finally starting to ease, an old man from town named Silas Broom climbed the ridge with difficulty, leaning on a cane, to see with his own eyes whether the rumors were true, that the Hale family was still alive, healthy, and even thriving in the cursed cabin. What he found left him speechless for a long while. Apple trees with new buds poking through the melting snow, hens pecking about the yard, smoke rising calm and steady from the chimney. Children laughing as they carried water from the well. Silas sat by the fire, accepted a cup of coffee Sarah offered him, and finally told the story no one else remembered correctly anymore. Those 3 families who died here 20 years ago didn't die because of this house. They arrived already sick with consumption. The doctor back then, the one who built this cabin with his own hands, brought them here on purpose, far from town, so they wouldn't infect anyone else. He lived with them. He cared for them until the end.
And when they died, all that was left was the rumor of a cursed house, because no one wanted to remember the truth, that this place never killed anyone. This place was the last act of kindness from a man nobody remembers by name anymore. Elijah listened in silence, the journal resting on his knees. "This man wasn't a witch or a madman," he finally said, showing the old man the notebook. "He was, simply, a man who paid attention. He observed for years what helped the sick and what harmed them. He had no scientific names for what he saw, but he knew that still air killed just as surely as the sickness itself." Silas Broom stared into the fire for a long while, his eyes damp. 20 years we feared a ghost that never existed, he murmured. And all along, the answer was right up here, waiting for someone to look at it again. When spring finally arrived and the epidemic began to retreat in Deadwood, one thing became clear to anyone who cared to notice. The Hale family, naturally isolated, ventilated day and night, fed on what they grew themselves, drinking clean water from their own spring, had made it through the entire winter without a single one of their 5 members falling ill. They hadn't been stronger than anyone else. They hadn't been luckier than anyone else. They had simply lived, without fully knowing it, by principles a forgotten doctor had written down in cramped handwriting decades before. Moving air, sunlight, clean water, distance from contagion. The news spread through town with the same speed fear once had. When Dr. Whitcomb, worn out after the hardest winter of his career, climbed up to the cabin to meet in person the family everyone in town was talking about, Elijah greeted him at the door and, without another word, handed him the small chest with the journal inside. "This doesn't belong to me anymore," he said. "It belongs to whoever comes next." The young doctor spent the whole night reading those pages by candlelight, and in the months that followed, he used that forgotten doctor's notes to better organize the town's future quarantines. Ventilated rooms instead of sealed ones, the sick separated with care instead of fear, clean water for every family. The cabin stopped being called the cursed house. The children of Deadwood, with that habit children have of renaming the world in their own way, started simply calling it the House of the Wind. As the years passed, the Hale family never grew rich, but they never again went hungry, nor feared the winter, nor depended on anyone's charity. The orchard grew until it bore more apples than they could eat, and every fall Sarah made enough cider to give away whole barrels to the town families who had once looked at them with pity. Mary's little herb corner grew into a garden that scented the whole ridge in summer, and over the years word spread that her infusions worked better than anything bought at the apothecary. Daniel, grown into a man, stayed to work the land alongside his father, and together they expanded the orchard to the neighboring slope. And Thomas, the youngest, the one who once chased goats until he was breathless, went on, many years later, to become the town's new doctor, the silent heir to that journal which had changed his family's fate. It's said that decades later, a boy, Elijah's grandson, looked at the always open windows of the old cabin and asked his grandfather, his hair now white, why they let so much cold into the house. The old man smiled, sat down by the fire, and answered with the same calm he always used for that question. Because some people learned, late, that the wind doesn't always bring sickness, boy. Sometimes it simply carries it away. Outside, the wind kept blowing over the ridge, as it had for generations, and the house everyone once feared still stood, full of life, warm smoke rising from its chimney, and a lesson no one in Deadwood dared to forget anymore.